This is my Modeling the October Scene clinic. I've presented this clinic numerous times over the years, and I thought I'd record it and share it on my YouTube channel. What do I mean by the October scene? Really what I'm talking about, since I model New England, is scenery that's applicable primarily east of the Rocky Mountains. And really the fall is several visually distinct seasons, but all of my previous layouts have been set in some point of the fall. I'm constantly tweaking my approach to this and trying new materials and techniques. My inspiration for this came from really primarily several folks, Les Jordan and Bill Henderson, and I have to offer a special tip of the hat to my good friend Paul Douglas, whose MR article, Modeling the November Scene, in the November 1993 issue of Model Railroader magazine, inspired more than just the title of this clinic. Fall is, as I said, a multifaceted season. There's numerous types of fall. Fall starting in September is going to look just like the summer. The trees are going to be green, the grass is going to be green, and as we move through the season, the colors and the leaves change. At some point they reach their peak and they're vibrant and very, very colorful. And then over time, they kind of get past peak and become more dull olive greens and more rusty tones. This is really kind of my favorite part of fall. And then we can go all the way through fall without any leaves on the trees, and it looks very much like winter. In fact, this looks very similar to what you would see through the early spring. This slide from Dave Sweetland, showing a set of Canadian National Sea Liners going past the Belchertown, Massachusetts station, really captures what I'm trying to get from the fall coloration on my layout. It's just slightly past peak. As you can see, there's grass is still slightly green or has a green hint to it, but there's a lot of tan grass. The trees are past their peak, but there's still some oranges and rust colors, but certainly the trees are not bare yet, and there's plenty of green trees in the distance. With that in mind, let's start talking about how I achieve this on the layout. The first thing I do is to plan the scenes. A few thoughts on that. I always try to leave some breathing room, and I always plan the open areas first, what I call white space. Before I start constructing a scene and adding the scenery textures and materials, I determine and stick to a consistent overall color tone, whether that be green, rust colors like you see here, or leafless trees. I consider view blocks, like partial view blocks such as screenings. Trees are great for that, especially if you model an area like New England where there's plenty of trees. Or you could also do full view blocks, which are essentially backdrops. Then I consider the materials and techniques to duplicate natural elements. What do I mean by white space? Well, white space is that negative area that really helps contribute to a sense of vastness and space on any model railroad. I also try to plan things towards vanishing points. You notice here, I'm trying to lead the eye away from the corner of the room. And what I plan to do here is add a backdrop mountain peak about where that X is shown. My idea with that is your eye will go towards that mountain peak and not towards the corner of the room. These pale green areas show areas where I'm considering potential white space. Once I have the basic concept of a scene in mind, I tend to do some 3D planning. Sometimes I'll have buildings, like you see the Creamery building, that white building in the foreground has its own base, so I'll place that in an approximate location. The barn moved around several times as I was planning this scene, and I like using these little blue clips that you see on the bottom of the tree here to just place various foreground sized trees in areas to get a feel for what the scene is going to look like. One thing that's true is that these foreground trees move around a great deal. You'll see that as you try to keep track of them in the pictures. Ultimately, I come up with an arrangement that looks pleasing, and here I've planted the buildings in place, and I'm ready to start adding some additional textures. The backdrop, you can see there the vanishing point with that mountain peak I discussed earlier. And you can see the white space, or the negative space, in the fields between the Creamery and the barn, between the barn and the road, and between the road and the river crossing scene that you can just barely see with that bright orange tree on the right. The first thing we need to do is create basic landforms. And for that, I really like to use foam board, which is pink or blue insulation board. You can get this at any home center. It comes in various thicknesses. It's easy to carve and shape, and it's great for sticking scenery details in. For areas that I know that I'm going to plant dense forests and stands of trees, I really prefer to use open cell foam, which is also called florist foam. That's the green foam you see in the left there. But the advantage of using the foam is that it's easy to shape to the natural terrain, and you can get gradual slopes and gradual undulations into the landform. It readily accepts natural material and doesn't leave glaring white spots like you would find with plaster. The disadvantage it has is that it's messy, it's somewhat pricey, and it's not readily available in some areas. For large open expanses of grass, I don't really bother with the foam though. I use cardboard web and a hard shell. For many years, I've used plaster molds for rock outcroppings. Then I discovered this material. This is cripple bush castings. These are just rubber rocks, essentially. They're very flexible. They come in a large sheet, and you just trim them out with a scissors or a knife, and you just stick them on the landform. Then I like to blend them together, as you see here with this one on the left. Once I get everything blended together, I paint the entire base of the scenery with my earth tone latex paint. And this is just a 1-gallon can of mismatched paint, flat paint specifically from Home Depot I got. I think I paid maybe $4 for it. Now it's time to start adding some textures to our scenery. For that, I use a combination of Woodland Scenics blended turf earth blend, like you see here, some finely sifted dirt. I got this one from Scenic Express. And to augment this, I use sanded tile grout, and you can see 3 colors of the sanded tile grout I use there. I take all this material and in a completely unscientific manner, spread it all out on the layout surface, on top of the hard shell surface or on top of the foam, to get a base layer of earth or dirt. I like to use a foam brush like you see here. It helps break up some of the larger clumps in the sanded tile grout, and it also helps smooth everything out and creates a nice base. Once this is applied, I wet it thoroughly and let it dry overnight. I find using the tile grout means I don't necessarily have to apply white glue or any kind of gluing agent to the dirt surface here. Any areas that are going to be covered with trees or woods, anything that's not going to be basically a field or a road, I spread full strength white glue in place, and then I sprinkle on essentially ground up real leaves. These are leaves that I harvest from the backyard in the fall. I stick them in a blender, grind them up finely, and then I use them as leaf fall on the layout. If you don't have access to leaves, or if you find you are trying to do a scenery project and there's 3 feet of snow on the ground, you can purchase pre-ground up leaves from Scenic Express. For this clinic, I had to buy some leaves because I didn't have any available. With the basic ground textures added, this is what the layout scene looks like. You can see here it's better looking than plain foam or plain plaster. Let's talk a little bit about backdrops. There's several approaches you can use to backdrops. You can paint them. You can use a photo backdrop. You can opt to go with a plain sky blue backdrop, which would basically just mean leave the wall sky blue. Or you could have no backdrop at all. If you choose to have a backdrop, I'd recommend that you make sure it's a smooth surface. There's nothing more distracting in a photograph than a concrete brick wall, even if it's painted blue, where the seams between the bricks are clearly visible in the background. The colors should be muted, and they should blend into the modeled scenery. Obviously, what I've chosen to do is to hand paint my own backdrops. One of the reasons I went with painted backdrops was it helps me blend the colors into the foreground scenery much better than I found I could do with a photograph. The other reason I went with painted backdrops is, since I don't model the current era, I didn't want to use photographs and then have to spend hours and hours in Photoshop removing contemporary elements. Besides, I firmly believe that backdrops should be seen and not heard. They should not be distracting. They should not be the first thing you notice when you see the layout. They should simply be there. And ideal to me is if somebody says afterwards, hey, did he have a backdrop? With the backdrop done and our basic ground form done, I turn my attention now to background, or what I call filler trees. For these, I use Scenic Express Supertrees, as you see here. I start by painting the armatures of the Supertrees after I remove the small little leaves that they have on them, which is a very tedious process. This shows some of the colors I like to use. I don't use brown and I don't use gray, but I use grayish browns and tans, and these are the 3 colors that I primarily use. Rust-Oleum camouflage brown. Then I use a color called Thorny Brush, which is a Valspar color that you can get from Lowe's. And I also like to use Sage Brush, which you see here on the right. I stick the Supertrees in a scrap panel of foam, take them outside on a day that's not terribly windy, and I just spray paint them. Some of the trees have more of the dark brown, some have more of the sagebrush, some have more of the other colors. Pretty much every tree armature ends up with some combination of the three colors. Then I flock the trees. The key to believable fall colors is to have a base tonal range that applies throughout your scenery. So you start with the base color for a tree and then apply to that base color up to 3 highlight colors. Let me show you what I mean. For green trees, and this would apply even if you're not modeling the fall, if you're modeling the summer, I start with a basic green color. On the top here you see knock medium green leaf. Then to that I highlight it with Scenic Express Super Leaf Moss Green. And what that produces is the color you see on the top right there, which is like an early fall tree. However, if you were modeling this in the summer, I would also suggest doing this, because what you're essentially doing is creating highlights and shadows within the body of your tree. You can see a similar approach with the dark green leaf in the bottom left-hand corner, highlighted with medium green, which is the same color as you see in the upper left, by the way, and then highlighted with moss green foam, and that creates an early fall oak color. Likewise, for the yellow or orangey trees, this is the color combination I use. And then finally the rust or reddish trees, these would represent, say, a later fall oak. One thing I personally find very distracting about Supertrees is what I call the crown on top of the tree. It's a natural element of the Supertree plant, but it doesn't look very realistic. Trees don't grow typically with a little peaked crown on top of them like you see here. So what I do is try to remove them before I actually flock the tree. If I don't catch it, I go through and just trim it off after I find it on the layout. When it comes to modeling grasses, we have a plethora of choices today, far more than just plain ground foam or dyed sawdust that I remember from my first days in the hobby. I like to use these Hecky grass mats. I also use grass mats from Martin Wellberg and some other manufacturers. One thing I do with any of them is I try to tease them out as much as possible. You don't want your scenery to look like you just placed clumps in place. I also blend them together. Here you see 2 colors of grass mats in place at the base of a rock outcropping. What I really tried to do is achieve a look, as you see in this photograph, of very, very dense underbrush, multicolored on both sides of the track. I have yet to add a rail fan wearing a jacket and tie to my scene. Let me walk you through how I achieved this. I started with this scene where the bend goes around by the creamery. Then I located this Martin Wellberg product, which is wild shrubbery. What I really liked about it is it had some bright yellow textures in there and some greens, and even had some exposed earth. But I didn't want to just take it and cut it and drop it down in place between the tracks and the pasture fence line. I started by cutting the material out of the basic sheet in various shapes, not being too precise, and making sure I didn't have any square corners. Then I cut V-shaped notches to slide it down around the telegraph poles. I glued it in place with full-strength Elmer's white glue, being sure to push down the edges and get them to seal to the surface of the scenery with an angled tweezers like you see here. When that was done, here's what the scene looks like. Not very realistic, is it? What we need to do, obviously, is fill in the gaps between these pieces of the Martin Wellberg scenery material. And for that, I used ordinary static grass. I have a number of varieties of static grass, all kinds of fall colors, some greens, and different lengths from a variety of manufacturers. I'd love to be able to offer you a precise combination of what I used to create the static grass effect. But to be honest with you, it's a little bit like my grandmother's cooking. I just used a pinch of this and a dash of that, throwing them in Dixie cups, and then I chucked a small piece of metal, usually a bolt or a screw in there, to help break up some of the clumps, put another cup on top of it, and shook it up. I then took that mixture and dumped it into the static grass applicator. Here we are, ready to put our static grass down in the foreground scene here. I'll admit that I've already added it to the background between the fence line and the track. The last thing you want to do with static grass is have it end up looking like a golf course. The best way to avoid that is to put the glue down in splotches, as you see here. And again, I'm just using ordinary Elmer's white glue. I do not use Elmer's school glue. I use the stuff with the blue and orange label, not the black label. Once that's done, I stick steel T-pins in each of the glue pools or glue areas before I start up the static grass applicator. That way it's easier for me to move the clip from one to the other. Here you see how I'm just adding the alligator clip and then shaking the static grass applicator over that specific spot. I'll work my way through the whole field, moving the alligator clip from one pin to the other until the whole surface is covered. I let this dry for about 10 to 15 minutes until the glue has just become tacky and holds most of the grass in place upright. Then I go over this holding my shop vac about 2 to 3 inches above the surface of the grass and suck up all the loose fibers. While it's not shown here, I usually put a stocking over the nozzle of the vacuum cleaner and salvage the grass. If you want to add some additional height to your grass or some additional colors or textures, one good way to do that is to just spray the grass after it's already dried with a coat of hairspray. Extra hold or ultra hold, the cheaper the better. And then simply use the static grass gun to add your additional textures. Or in this case, you can also sprinkle on some colored ground foam to create the look of weeds and bushes that are blooming. One thing you might notice with a large amount of static grass is that it has a shiny texture to it. To tone it down and get rid of that sheen, I simply airbrush it with a combination of Burton Raw Umber and Burton Raw Sienna, which are basic earth colors. I use golden airbrush paint for that. Vallejo also offers a World War II color set that's great for toning down static grass. You can see here on the left I have a patch of grass that's too green and too shiny, and you can see what they look like after I've gone over it with a light airbrushing. Now, I talked about background trees a little while ago. Let me talk about foreground trees. And at first I was going to offer 2 ways to make foreground trees, but you're going to get a bonus today, and I'm going to explain 3 ways I do these. What is a foreground tree? Well, it's any tree where the trunk is obvious. At least that's how I define it. Why do we need detailed foreground trees? Well, real trees are tall. They help frame a scene, and in groups, as I said earlier, they can serve as a soft view block. They can screen a scene and not necessarily block your view of it completely. When you make super trees for your background scenes, you're going to end up with a lot of little scraps. These things you see in the upper left-hand corner are little schnibbles of super trees. Your first instinct might be to throw them out. I keep them, and then I use them to make foreground trees. This first approach to foreground trees uses Woodland Scenics plastic armatures. You can also get plastic armatures from other manufacturers. And then I just use CA or super glue to go through and attach those little scraps of super trees to the branches. And after 20 minutes or so, you end up with a fairly bulked out tree that looks pretty good. These are ideal for N scale. This is a photo on an N scale project layout I built years ago. And you can see the foreground tree on the right hand side there is that reddish tree. Works out really well. There's a couple of other ones visible in the distance. The other approach is to use natural armatures. Now, those of you who live north of, say, New Jersey are going to have a problem finding this plant. But those of us who live in the southeastern United States and out in California are very familiar with crepe myrtles. Crepe myrtles are a flowering plant that comes in a variety of sizes, but they all have one thing in common. They have these cone-shaped flowers that when they die off in the late summer and early fall, they produce these little heads that you see on the right-hand side there with all this open seed pods. If you trim off the seed pods and trim away some of those extra branches, you get pretty close to a decent looking tree armature. And here's a step-by-step process of how I build up some of these crepe myrtle trees. The branch on the left there is actually a couple of crepe myrtle branches that are stuck together, and then I blend the trunks together, and I'll show you that in a minute. The middle shot shows it with, again, super tree material, hot glued in place, and the right-hand side is a crepe myrtle tree that's been flocked. You can get a little creative with putting these trees together. Sometimes I'll use 2 or 3 of them in various lengths, cut to various angles, and create a branching structure. And then you'll notice there's visible gaps between the branches where the different twigs were glued together. To blend that together, I like to use golden molding paste, which is essentially an extremely thick gel medium. And you can see here on the right where I'm just kind of blending that together to get the tree to look a little more legitimate. You also might notice at the bottom of the tree I have some of the exposed roots showing. That's simply done just by drawing the brush across the piece of wax paper I have on the bottom. I let the paste dry, and it creates a nice, interesting bark texture. And then I simply give it a wash of dark gray paint, and then add some highlights. The third way to make trees is perhaps one of the oldest in model railroading, and that's to use wire armatures. This shot is on my friend Bernie Kempinski's U.S. Military Railroad. It's an O-scale railroad, and some of these trees are 14, 16, and 18 inches tall that you see in the foreground. To do this, you start by twisting together a couple of wires, and then you twist those 2 wires together, and then you twist those 6 wires together, and you just keep twisting wires together until you end up with essentially a tree shape. You can see here on the left where that starts to look like a tree. This does usually take several coats of molding paste to create a legitimate looking trunk. With that all done, you can glue a finer twig material or branch material in there. Again, this is Supertree material, but I've also used baby's breath that you get from a florist shop. Here's an example of a completed twisted wire tree, and this is the one that's in the foreground of the scene you saw with the creamery and the title shot. This armature was built up from about 60 to 80 wire pairs. It's about 9 inches tall. Got about 6 coats of molding paste to build up the trunk. All the foliage is a Supertree scraps that are glued to the wire frame. Then I lightly flocked it with a base and 2 highlight colors. Well, those are my thoughts on building fall scenery. If you want regular updates on my layout and my modeling, check out my blog at Central Vermont Railway. That's Central Vermont Railway, all one word squished together, .blogspot.com. And for more details on modeling the October scene, be sure to see my article, Modeling October Scenery, in the November 2015 issue of Model Railroader magazine. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.